Trump is bending over backwards to protect American steel, and Canada is paying the price. At a steel plant in Pennsylvania in May, U.S. President Donald Trump made a promise that would reshape North American trade forever. We are once again going to put Pennsylvania steel into the backbone of America, like never before, Trump declared, reflecting how he sees steel as the centerpiece of a revitalized American industrial capacity. But how would he do it? Through a sophisticated tariff workaround that means Canada is bearing the brunt of Trump's promises in America's steel-heavy swing states. This isn't just about trade policy, it's about a calculated strategy to circumvent international agreements while devastating one of America's closest allies.
After a U.S. appeals court took aim at Donald Trump's trade war, members of his administration are firing back.
This was weaponized partisan injustice at its worst.
The court ruled many of Trump's tariffs enacted without Congress by declaring national emergencies are illegal, including the ones against Canada and Mexico, based on accusations of cross-border fentanyl trafficking.
If China and the drug cartels from Mexico and Canada stop killing Americans tomorrow, tariffs go away. Ditto if the trade deficit went to zero.
But charges that this ruling is partisan fall flat, with the dissent written by a Democrat. A Barack Obama appointee, says this former U.S. District Court judge.
The legal battle over these tariffs has exposed their questionable foundation. A U.S. appeals court recently ruled that many of Trump's emergency tariffs are illegal, including those imposed on Canada and Mexico. The court found that Trump had improperly used the International Economic Emergency Powers Act to bypass congressional authority. Despite Trump administration officials calling this weaponized partisan injustice, the ruling was actually bipartisan in nature, with judges appointed by both parties joining the majority opinion. To understand what Trump is doing, we need to examine the tariff trick he's pulling. The U.S. president has weaponized the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, to impose broad reciprocal tariffs against countries around the world. For Canada, that's set at 35% for goods not covered by the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. Some countries, such as Brazil and India, are facing much higher IEEPA tariffs of 50%. These sweeping tariffs were declared illegal by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit on Friday, but the 7-4 decision delayed enforcement until mid-October. This gives the White House time to appeal its case to the Supreme Court.
Well, the lower court is called the Court of International Trade, and that's where the lawsuit was brought. And that court said that the tariffs that he imposed were unconstitutional and that he used a statute that doesn't apply, the International Economic Emergency Power Act, IEEPA is what we call it. And they said he didn't have the power to do what he did. Of course, he appealed immediately, and that went to the Federal Circuit Court, a special court that hears appeals from the Court of International Trade and also from the Court of the Patent Court. So they're a very specialized circuit. And they did a smart thing. They decided to sit what's called en banc, meaning all the judges of that circuit sat together, all 11, instead of a panel of 3, because if they'd sat by 3, then there would have been an en banc appeal. So now we've skipped that stage. And the 11 judges of the Federal Circuit split 7-4 on last night's decision. 7 of the judges again agreed with the lower court and said his tariffs were unconstitutional. But 4 dissented and said they thought it was okay. And interestingly, he called it a partisan court, but the dissenting opinion was written by a judge appointed by President Obama. So as usual, I think President Trump is way off base in thinking that judges are political and they rule in accordance with the principles of the president who appointed them. That doesn't seem to be the case at all.
The constitutional questions at stake are fundamental. Under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Congress, not the president, has the power to levy taxes, which historically included tariffs as the primary form of taxation. This separation of powers issue could ultimately determine whether Trump's tariff strategy survives. Legal experts predict the Supreme Court will likely take the case, though the outcome remains uncertain, given the court's recent deference to executive power. Whatever happens with the IEEPA tariffs, Trump has made it clear he has no intention of stopping there. He's also leveraged his authority under the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 to target imports from specific sectors. Through Section 232 tariffs, Trump is restricting imports he has deemed a national security risk, particularly steel, aluminum, and auto parts. On June 3rd, the president doubled his tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from 25 to 50%. And in early August, he added copper to the list. But here's where the strategy gets truly sophisticated. In mid-August, the U.S. Commerce Department significantly expanded the scope of the Section 232 tariffs to include 407 products containing levels of steel and aluminum. The list includes products with varying proportions of metal in them, everything from aerosol cans for whipped cream to furniture to auto and machinery parts. Today's action expands the reach of the steel and aluminum tariffs and shuts down avenues for circumvention, supporting the continued revitalization of the American steel and aluminum industries, said Jeffrey Kessler, the Commerce Department's Undersecretary for Industry and Security. These tariffs apply to any and all countries that export these metals to the U.S. But Canada, the number one supplier of U.S. steel imports, takes the brunt of this assault. According to trade data, Canada supplied $8.36 billion worth of steel to the United States last year, followed by Brazil and Mexico. That makes Canada responsible for roughly 23% of all U.S. steel imports and an astonishing 60% of aluminum imports. Every other country, apart from Canada and Mexico, already faces automat, IEEPA tariffs of 25% or higher, whatever the metal content of their products. But the expanded 232 tariffs enable Washington to tariff goods from Canada that would otherwise be untouchable under the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. And that's exactly the point. It's a deliberate workaround designed to bypass trade protections. The genius of Trump's strategy lies in its complexity. By layering different types of tariffs, IEEPA tariffs, Section 232 tariffs, and derivative product expansions, the administration has created a web of trade barriers that effectively neutralize Canada's trade agreement protections. This isn't accidental, it's calculated economic warfare disguised as national security policy. The impact on Canada is devastating. The country exports roughly $35 billion worth of steel and aluminum products to the United States annually. Quebec alone exported roughly $14 billion of these products, mostly aluminum, accounting for just under 2.5% of the province's GDP. Ontario exported $16.3 billion of mostly steel products, representing just under 1.5% of its economy. When Trump imposed similar tariffs between 2018 and 2019, Canadian exports of steel and aluminum fell by around 20%. The scope for Canadian producers to boost exports to other countries to offset the hit to demand is severely limited, given that around 90% of Canada's steel and aluminum products are sent to the U.S. But Trump's strategy goes beyond simple protectionism. By targeting derivative products, items that contain varying amounts of steel and aluminum, he's essentially created a tariff system that can hit virtually any manufactured good. An aerosol can for whipped cream now faces the same 50% tariff as a steel beam. A piece of furniture with metal components is treated the same as raw aluminum. This expansion means that Canadian manufacturers who thought they were protected under CUSMA suddenly find themselves facing punitive tariffs on products they never expected to be targeted. The administration has even modified the stacking order of tariffs to ensure maximum impact. Previously, if an import was subject to IEEPA fentanyl trade-related tariffs from Canada, then Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs didn't apply. Now it's the reverse. If an import is subject to Section 232 tariffs on steel or aluminum, the IEEPA fentanyl tariffs on imports from Canada don't apply. This ensures that Canadian steel and aluminum products face the higher 50% Section 232 tariffs rather than the 35%. IEEPA tariffs. The human cost of Trump's tariff strategy is significant. According to the Canadian Labour Congress, 43,000 Canadian jobs are directly or indirectly at risk from these tariffs. These aren't just statistics, they represent families and communities across Canada whose livelihoods depend on the steel and aluminum trade. The irony is that Trump's tariffs may actually hurt American consumers and businesses more than they help. U.S. tariffs are fees paid by American businesses that import foreign goods, costs that are then often passed on to U.S. consumers. The Tax Foundation estimates that these tariffs amount to an average tax increase of nearly $1,300 per U.S. household in 2025. American manufacturers who rely on Canadian steel and aluminum inputs now face significantly higher costs. A study by the U.S. International Trade Commission found that while tariffs reduced imports from targeted countries, they had only minor effects on actually stimulating more U.S. production of the tariffed goods. This suggests that the tariffs are more effective at raising costs than at achieving their stated goal of revitalizing American industry. Canada has already begun retaliating with its own tariffs on U.S. exports. On March 13, 2025, Canada imposed 25% tariffs on $20.7 billion worth of U.S. exports. Additional tariffs on $30.5 billion worth of U.S. automobiles are also in place. Polling data shows that Canadians are more likely to support these retaliatory tariffs even if prices increase domestically. However, they remain opposed to signing any deal with the U.S. that includes tariffs on Canadian exports.
It's interesting, Roger. We ask about Canadians or the Canadian government whether there be support for tariffs on imports from U.S. goods coming into Canada, even if the prices go up. And what's clear is that Canadians are much more likely to support rather than oppose tariffs on the imports from the U.S. And, the thing is that, even when we look at whether they think that a deal with the U.S. is worth signing, if it includes some sort of tariffs on Canadian imports, it's much more of a mixed bag. You can see that people are more likely to oppose rather than support. So, the thing is that Canadians are okay with tariffs and paying for the cost, but they are not hot on a deal that could include tariffs on Canadian goods and are worried about the trade-offs on that front.
Highlighting the complex public sentiment north of the border. This tit-for-tat escalation is exactly what trade economists warn about when countries abandon multilateral trade rules in favor of unilateral action. The World Trade Organization, which is supposed to regulate international trade, has been effectively paralyzed since 2019 when the United States blocked new appointments to its appellate body. Without a functioning dispute resolution mechanism, countries have little recourse when faced with what they consider to be unfair trade practices. The strategic implications extend beyond economics. Canada has been one of America's most reliable allies, sharing the longest undefended border in the world and cooperating on everything from defense to energy security. Canadian steel and aluminum support key industries in the U.S., from automotive manufacturing to infrastructure projects. By targeting these critical supply chains, Trump is essentially weaponizing economic interdependence against a close ally. The timing of these tariffs is particularly telling. They come as Trump faces pressure to deliver on campaign promises to revitalize American manufacturing, particularly in swing states like Pennsylvania, where steel production is both economically and symbolically important. The steel industry in Pennsylvania has been in decline for decades, and Trump's promises to bring back steel jobs resonate strongly with voters who remember when the region was the heart of American steel production. But the reality is more complex than Trump's rhetoric suggests. The decline of American steel wasn't primarily due to unfair foreign competition. It was the result of technological change, shifts in the global economy, and the rise of more efficient production methods elsewhere. Simply imposing tariffs won't reverse these fundamental changes. What Trump's tariff strategy does accomplish is the appearance of action. By targeting foreign steel imports with dramatic tariff increases, he can claim to be fighting for American workers while actually imposing costs on American consumers and businesses. It's a politically savvy strategy that allows him to appear tough on trade while avoiding the harder work of actually addressing the structural challenges facing American manufacturing. Trump's promises to use tariff revenue to replace income taxes remain largely unfulfilled.
Well,
I mean, to the extent that this ruling touches on things that pertain to the arguments that are being made by Canada, perhaps, but the discussion between Canada and the United States isn't about legal powers. It's not about constitutionality. It's about politics and economics. And it's on those fronts that I think they've got the greatest leverage. The reality is that many of the people that Trump wants to have vote for him or for his party rather in the midterm elections, many of them are affected negatively by the tariffs that are in place. A lot of goods that are extraordinarily important to folks in the United States that they cannot produce from within effectively. Housing, for example, is affected. All kinds of things where aluminum and steel are involved, particularly those who source those goods from Canada. Those prices are going up. The pressure is going to come from consumers, that is voters, on the government to make changes. And it's those political and economic realities, I think, that are going to have a bigger impact long term.
While tariffs are generating more revenue than in the past, they're nowhere near sufficient to replace the income tax system. The idea that foreign countries pay U.S. tariffs, a claim Trump has repeatedly made, is simply false. U.S. tariffs are paid by American importers, who typically pass these costs on to consumers. Political analysts note that Trump's voter base is being negatively affected by existing tariffs, particularly in sectors like housing and industries, requiring aluminum and steel from Canada. Rising prices are creating pressure from consumers and voters on the government to make changes. By July 2025, tariffs represented 5% of federal revenue compared to 2% historically. This suggests that the tariffs are generating significant revenue for the U.S. government, but at the cost of higher prices for American consumers and reduced economic efficiency. The average applied U.S. tariff rate rose from 2.5% to an estimated 27% from January to April 2025, the highest level in over a century. After some changes and negotiations, the rate was estimated at 18.6% as of August 2025, but this still represents a dramatic departure from decades of trade liberalization. The steel and aluminum industries that Trump claims to be protecting have shown mixed results from his tariff policies. While some domestic producers have benefited from reduced competition, others have struggled with higher input costs for derivative products. The complexity of modern supply chains means that a tariff on raw materials can hurt downstream manufacturers even as it helps upstream producers. Looking ahead, the sustainability of Trump's tariff strategy remains questionable. The legal challenges continue to work their way through the courts, and the economic costs are mounting for American consumers and businesses. International partners are retaliating with their own tariffs, potentially escalating into a broader trade war that could harm global economic growth. Canada, for its part, is exploring ways to diversify its export markets to reduce dependence on the United States. This could include expanding trade relationships with European and Asian partners, though the geographic advantages of the U.S.-Canada trade relationship make complete diversification difficult. The lesson is clear: economic dependence on any single partner, even a close ally, carries significant risks.
Yeah, these numbers really popped, and it speaks to the environment. You can see that Canadians don't really have a lot of confidence that U.S. President Trump will honor his word, even if a trade deal is signed between Canada and the United States. And what's clear, at least for a lot of Canadians, at least, is they see Donald Trump, and this is part of his negotiating strategy, is to always ask for more, always change things, always keep his opponents or his negotiating counterparty off balance. And that's just part of the way the guy operates. That's why he, love or hate him, he has been a success. He is the president of the United States. But, the thing is that even if a trade deal is signed between Canada and the United States, there will be lingering doubts as to whether the terms of that trade deal will be enforced and whether they're in place.
Okay, Nick, thanks.
Polling reveals that Canadians have little confidence that President Trump will honor his word even if a trade deal is signed. They view Trump's negotiating strategy as one of constantly asking for more and keeping counterparties off balance, creating lingering doubts about whether any agreement's terms will actually be enforced. The 407 products now subject to expanded Section 232 tariffs represent a new frontier in trade policy. By targeting derivative products with varying levels of steel and aluminum content, Trump has essentially created a system where the definition of what constitutes a strategic material can be expanded almost indefinitely. This precedent could be used to justify tariffs on virtually any manufactured product by claiming it contains materials essential to national security. The enforcement of these complex tariff rules is creating significant challenges for U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Determining the exact steel and aluminum content of derivative products requires detailed technical analysis that may be beyond the capacity of border officials. This could lead to arbitrary enforcement and additional uncertainty for businesses trying to comply with the new rules. Trump, tariff strategy represents more than just a trade policy. It's a fundamental challenge to the post-World War II international economic order. By unilaterally imposing tariffs and bypassing multilateral trade agreements, the United States is signaling that it no longer considers itself bound by the rules it helped create. The implications of this shift extend far beyond the steel and aluminum industries. If successful, Trump's approach could encourage other countries to abandon multilateral trade rules in favor of bilateral power politics. This could lead to a fragmentation of the global economy into competing trade blocs, reversing decades of economic integration. The ultimate irony of Trump's steel tariff strategy is that it may achieve the opposite of its stated goals. By imposing costs on American manufacturers and consumers while alienating close allies, the tariffs could weaken rather than strengthen American economic competitiveness. The complex web of derivative product tariffs creates administrative burdens and uncertainties that could discourage investment and innovation in American manufacturing. As the legal challenges to these tariffs continue and their economic impacts become clearer, the sustainability of Trump's approach will be tested. But for now, Canada continues to pay the price for Trump's promises to American steelworkers, caught in a tariff trick that bypasses decades of carefully negotiated trade agreements. The question remains whether this strategy will ultimately strengthen American industry or simply impose costs on consumers, while damaging relationships with key allies. What's certain is that Trump's tariff workaround represents a fundamental shift in how the United States approaches international trade, with consequences that will be felt for years to come. Canada, $8.3 $6 billion steel export relationship with the United States hangs in the balance, a casualty of domestic politics disguised as national security policy.